Hi there. Some of you may know me. My name is Jeremy McCandless, and some of you may know me from the Bible Project Daily podcast. And having just said a few weeks ago that I wouldn't be posting any more videos, I was going to focus on the audio content of that work, which is basically a 5-10 year plan to work through the whole Bible chapter by chapter, verse by verse. I really feel called to say something at this time, at this day, about the death of our Queen here in the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. I grew up in a place where the position of the royal family was felt to be really, really important, and I would just like to share with you what her death means to me personally, and also just think about it a moment, because it really has some incredible spiritual, you might even say theological significance for our nation. Now, I know if you've come to this through my other ministry, there's about an 80% chance that you're American, and it might be helpful for you to understand the constitutional position that the Queen held within our country and how that lines up with the biblical concept of leadership. The first time I personally ever really thought seriously about God was when the Queen told me to do so. I remember listening to a Christmas Day message when I was about 12 or 13 and thinking, wow, she really takes this Jesus stuff seriously. Queen Elizabeth, our Queen, was an outstanding example of a whole-of-life disciple of Jesus Christ, someone whose faith shaped everything she said and everything she did. I grew up believing that Queen Elizabeth was in a sense God's gift to the British people, including at that time Northern Ireland, but since that day it's become clearer and clearer to me that she was not only a gift from God to our nation, but also to the Commonwealth of Nations, and indeed the whole global community, because she stood as a beacon of humility, grace, wisdom, and generosity, and deep, deep faith. Dare I say it, she was even God's Queen for these times. She was indeed a remarkable woman, and there are many, many people out there making statements and giving their plaudits. But what I came to see, and it has been confirmed by others, because my father had the privilege of meeting her a few times when he received these sort of gongs, these awards, and my uncle saw her quite a few times. In fact, he lunched with her several times. And what they told me, and what has been confirmed to me by many other people that I've heard have met her and experienced a meeting with her in real life, is that she was first and foremost a disciple of Jesus Christ. And as such, she offered an extraordinary example of consistent godliness in one of the longest and most public, I would say, global Christian ministries in the history of our world, certainly in recent history anyway. Now, since her death, the newspapers here, and I'm sure around the world, have been filled with eulogies from family and friends, prime ministers and former prime ministers, leaders of Commonwealth countries, world leaders, religious leaders, not forgetting all the royal correspondents in the media, even celebrities. We have heard from them about her extraordinary dedication to duty, of her dignity, of her diligence, of her capacity to change with the times. We hear about her astute leadership skills, her wisdom, and of her curiosity and intelligence, and also her ability to make ordinary people feel comfortable when they were in their presence. And more than that, to make ordinary people feel that they were valued and what they did was of value. We have also seen the emotional resilience, because she herself, of course, has dealt with bereavement, fires, a destructive fire in her home, her favourite home, and also the divorce of three of her children, which must have brought her a lot of personal pain. And there has been some scandals along the way as well, not with her, but in relation to members of her wider family. But we also have seen her capacity to forgive. Not only to shake hands with the people responsible for killing British soldiers, her soldiers you might say, and those people responsible for the murder of her great friend and the mentor of her husband, a man called Lord Mountbatten. But when she was called to offer the hand of peace, she did it with great grace and a warm smile. She seems to be someone who excelled, almost revelled in the mission to help bring peace and reconciliation where previously there had been conflict. Now, there's been little attempt in the mainstream media to look at her life through the lens of who she was as a Christian and how that made a difference to her, just how important her faith in Christ was. But indeed, by her words, and particularly her messages to the nation and the Commonwealth over the years, she herself repeatedly referred to it. In her Christmas 2014 broadcast, she put it this way: "For me, the life of Jesus Christ, the Prince of Peace, whose birth we celebrate today, is an inspiration and an anchor in my life, a role model of reconciliation and forgiveness. He stretched out his hands in love and acceptance and healing. Christ's example has taught me to seek and respect the value of all people, of whatever faith or none." Brilliantly, in this age, she walked into the world which on one hand was increasingly secular, yet on the other was fraught by conflicts, and her approach was always to point people to Jesus as the answer. And it was through that love of Jesus that she offered her support and her love to other people. Her approach was never theological. It was never apologetic. It was never argumentative. She told the world of the inspiration Jesus had been in her own life and left others to decide if they were interesting or wished to be inspired that way themselves. In 2014, in that same Christian message, she said, "I hope that, like me, you will be comforted by the example of Jesus of Nazareth, who often in circumstances of great adversity managed to live an outgoing, unselfish and sacrificial life." Continuing what she said, "Countless millions of people around the world continue to celebrate his birthday at Christmas, inspired by his teaching. He makes it clear that genuine human happiness and satisfaction lie more in giving than receiving, more in serving than being served. And we should be grateful that 2,000 years later, after the birth of Jesus, so many are able to draw inspiration from his life and his message, and to find him as a source of strength and courage." More broadly, we see the influence of Christ in the understanding of her role, her job as Queen, and how she did it. And that, to a great extent, is more important and was more influential in terms of her position and her effect in the world. A lot of people don't know that the moment when she officially became Queen, during that coronation ceremony, there was about 5 or 10 minutes which weren't televised because it was deemed at that time too holy for mass broadcast. It was the moment when she went behind a square curtain and was stripped of all her flowing robes, all her crowns, all the regalia of earthly things, and simply knelt in a plain white dress, almost like a baptismal surplice, and she was anointed with holy oil. And it was at that moment she dedicated herself to God by serving her people. And I believe as a young woman of 25, she didn't arrive fully formed as the gracious lady of 96 that we saw in service over these last 70 years. But I believe the great calling point for her, the great calling point for her adventure was the undertaking of those biblical vows within that ceremonial service that placed her model of Christ-like servant leadership at the center of everything we do. And of course, sacrifice is at the heart of the gospel that she believed in. It talks about Jesus giving his life for ours. And at its heart, it's all about discipleship, about we too taking up our cross daily to follow him. So sacrifice has always been intertwined with service. We no longer live for ourselves when called by God to service, but we live for God and the service of others. And that is what characterized the Queen's approach, not only to her work, but to her whole understanding of the society at which she stood as its representative head. Queen Elizabeth's understanding of this role was at an intensely deep level. She knew her nation's role in the world, and she knew that it all needed to be robustly shaped on a biblical framework. I can say this with authority because way back in 1957, she said this: "I cannot lead you into battle. I do not give you laws or administer justice, but I can do something else. I can give you my heart and my devotion to these old islands and all the people of our brotherhood of nations. I believe in our qualities and our strength, and I believe that together we can set an example in the world that will encourage upright people everywhere." Now, in the context in 1957 of Britain's imperial past and some of the problems that people could pick out of that reasonably, this represents something remarkable. It is probably she's probably the first person to have a vision of how to change the empire to a commonwealth. Now, the world is always making trades and treaties and forming mutual interest alliances amongst countries. But this, my friends, was not a vision of military superiority. It was not even based on economic dominance or economic improvement. Nor was it based on any creative brilliance or suggesting our nation's sporting excellence, both of which always excelled well above the natural level that you would expect, but it was a moral example of a community of nation, a vision that would not inspire envy or fear, but rather encourage generosity, justice, kindness, and uprightness. It's a close as possible mirror of the original call that God made for the hope of the people of Israel in the Bible, that they would be a light to the nations. And as the granddaughter of a king who himself ruled over a quarter of the planet just a quarter of a century earlier, to her, what mattered now in her reign was the quality of the example that she would give and our nation would give to the world. And by doing so, I believed she saved United Kingdom and Great Britain from obsolescence. This vision of the development of the Commonwealth of Nations is arguably one of her greatest achievements. When she became queen, it consisted of 8 nations, primarily ruled by white men, even in places at that time which were predominantly ethnically black. And today it consists of 54 nations and territories ruled by both men and women of different colours, ethnic groups and background. Now, while some won't want to focus on the negative aspects of our colonial past, still today, nations today are still seeking to join this Commonwealth family. So how did she turn once conquered and ruled for decades nations into true friends and partners? How has this happened in our deeply fractured world that 54 nations should choose to meet regularly, not out of a desire for security, not out of a desire for military power, not even out of a desire for economic self-interest, but out of a commitment for a vision for a better kind of world and shared values. The short answer to that is, I think that through Queen Elizabeth's determination, the warmth of her character, and what I believe was her biblical vision of the role of Queen and the throne upon which she sat. When she took the throne, she said this: "The Commonwealth bears no resemblance to the empire of the past. It is an entirely new conception built on the highest qualities of friendship, loyalty, and the desire for freedom and peace. To that new conception of an equal partnership of nations and races, I shall give myself heart and soul every day of my life." So her commitment, we hear about how much it was to the Commonwealth, but you can see from that her commitment was equally to the nation of Great Britain, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, but the Commonwealth and thereby the whole world also. In her lifetime, she sat over the transition of a British Empire into a Commonwealth of nations, and she transformed the crown from potentially becoming a historic emblem of domination to a symbol of free and voluntary association. And in all history, I don't believe there's ever been a precedent. So where did the Queen get such a vision? Well, I would suggest it comes straight out of the biblical promise of a day when one day Isaiah puts it, where swords will be turned into plowshares, or as we might say, tanks will be turned into tractors. A day when nation will not fight against nation, and when peace will reign across the globe. Now, don't get me wrong, Queen Elizabeth knew absolutely that that would only be fully realised when Christ returned and the creation is renewed. But it did not stop her working tirelessly to create a context in which that perspective could thrive, could grow, could flourish, and that inequality could still be addressed. So you see, her authority does not lie within the structure of the society in which she was put at the top, if you like, but her authority came from her embracing a model, a biblical model of servant leadership. Just as, did you notice that when she signed off her last public letter, her 70th Diamond Jubilee letter to the nation in the Commonwealth, she signed it, "Your servant, Elizabeth R." She knew at the top of any real hierarchy needed to sit God himself, and everything, including herself, needed to be subservient to that. She understood that she only stood as a figurehead. The monarchy, the system, was not the thing itself. God was the thing itself. She was a representative figure, an earthly model of that which already existed in heaven itself. And I believe she profoundly understood this. There is a story in the Old Testament which visibly describes what happens to a nation that is led away from the servant model of societal leadership and structure. It tells the story of a group of people who decided to construct a city and build a great tower in the middle made of bricks, of all things. Apparently this was a different way to the conventional way of building something at that time. The usual way in antiquity was to build things made with natural stones and put the clay between them to hold them together. But this time they chose to build a city and a tower, and it was a man-made tower made of bricks instead of natural stones. But if you look at this story closely, you can't help but ask, is it significant that they wanted to reach the heavens? The design, it seems, has a religious significance. Now, many have included that this reference to it extending to heaven indicates a religious meaning. And in fact, the verses openly tell us that its purpose was to reach heaven, to enable people to be, as they say, access to heaven. But they wanted to do that in that place where in a few chapters earlier, God had instructed these people to be fruitful and multiply and spread his plan and purpose throughout the whole world. And that is where we see the Lord stepped in. It actually says in the text that God came down, which is an interesting choice of phrase. Because may I also point out to you that in the New Testament we are also told that God came down in the person of Jesus Christ. But in the New Testament, he came down to dwell amongst us in the person of Christ, and he came down in an act of redemption. But in this case, God is seen to come down on an act of judgment because of this city-state societal structure that is being created here right early on in the beginning of one of the first accounts of man's early prehistory. God comes down and sees this city-state being built and this tower being constructed, and he sees the builders expecting to be able to ascend to heaven. In other words, to try and access heaven on the basis of their own efforts. The people of Babel are trying to meet God on their terms, instead of which God then descends to earth and meets them on his terms. Now, the meaning of this passage is an important one, and you might ask, where does it relate in relation to our Queen and her position in our Constitution? Well, what this tells me is that if people are unified in the wrong way, they will try and do whatever they feel they want, meaning their spiritual and emotional drives can be let loose to seek out and do every conceivable sin they can think of. That's what's going on there, and God's response in those days was immediate. In fact, it says his response, immediate, is interesting. It says he comes down and confuses their language so they could not understand each other, and thereby they scattered from there all over the earth, and the building of the city stopped. So that's a fascinating response to what's going on here. But what does it mean, and what does it teach us today in the light of the death of Queen Elizabeth II? In this story, the people gathered together in one place and were unified behind one political vision. And they tried to build a tower that will reach heaven. And I would suspect they believed that it would erase the distinction between heaven and earth. So among other things, what this is pointing out is that this is people with a very early, probably the first, utopian vision of a future. They think they can build something so large and encompassing that it can give them access to and even replace heaven itself. And I believe that the one thing that we must surely learn from the 20th century is that it is exceedingly dangerous to follow totalitarian utopian visions. We all know what happened in the 20th century with the widespread and proliferation of these utopian ideologies, whether on the left or the right. Horrors happened on scales that had never happened and been seen to happen in human history before. Now, there was plenty of horror, of course, before the 20th century, but I suppose because of the Industrial Revolution, there wasn't as much industrial clout for people to bring these evil, I would say satanic visions to fruition. So in this early biblical narrative, we have a warning against arrogance and about building a society that doesn't put God at the top. We need our social systems to be large enough to protect us, of course, but they need to be small enough so that everyone has and can find their place in them. Isn't it interesting, in the few totalitarian states left in the world, the leader, the dear leader, the great leader, is seen as a god or seen as someone who replaces God. It's interesting that in the biblical narrative, Satan is the highest angel in God's heavenly kingdom before his fall. He's depicted as someone with extraordinary intellect and talent. He's actually referred to as the bright shining star. And that intellect that shone above all others, Satan decided to use it and to say, you know what? I can do all I want to do without God. And he foments this spiritual rebellion. Now, the immediate consequences are seen, and Satan gets to a point where he is saying that he can be self-sufficient and he can do without God. This is surely, even if you just view it as a symbolic picture, it's still an amazing warning. Some would say a prophetic warning to anyone who think they can live without a godly vision in their life, both individually, but importantly in this context, prophetically and collectively. I personally believe that this Tower of Babel story warns that sometimes things can be too big to stand. In 2008, the Queen asked the Governor of the Bank of England when she was being given a tour why things went wrong with the worldwide economic crash. And the answer he gave her was, "We really don't know yet." Her reply was simplistic to the point of genius. "Well, then you'd better find out," she said. Maybe the statement at that time, which was buzzing around that the banks were too big to fail, should have been reversed. Maybe the system had become so big it had to fail. That's what I think the story of the Tower of Babel is about. It's a warning against arrogance, but it's also a warning against totalitarianism. And it's a warning against thinking that you can do without God in the individual lives or in the society in which you attempt to live and construct. In her broadcasts, Queen Elizabeth made many broadcasts, Christmas and occasional, and she tended to highlight the particular qualities that she valued in the nation and the Commonwealth that she had symbolic leadership over: resilience, kindness, neighbourliness, qualities that she herself had seen in her wartime generation. When she spoke one of her last great speeches, which was during the COVID-19 pandemic, she too was isolated on her own, separated from her family, an old lady in her mid-90s, yet she still focused on those qualities, summoning us up to all live up to our Christian heritage. She said, "I hope in the years to come," well, she first of all talked about we will all one day be able to get back together again and see our families again and live a life that's more normal. So she planted the seed of hope. But then she said, "I hope in the years to come we'll be able to take pride in how we responded to this challenge, and that those who come after us will say, you know, the British people of that generation were as strong as any before, and their attributes of self-discipline, quiet, good-humoured resolve, and fellow feeling still characterise this country. The pride in who we are, not in our past, not in that alone, because only in the sense our past defines our present and our future." In what would be her last Christmas address, she returned to the message that she first visioned back in 1980, where she chose again the parable of the Good Samaritan as a call to serve our neighbours and our countries in whatever role we found ourselves. And in doing so, I believe she offered a wide-ranging picture of good citizenship that can be applied anywhere and all around the world. And you know what? I don't think that speech has ever better described that in non-theological language, in public rhetoric. I don't think it's ever been bettered. The message highlighted unselfish service as the key to good citizenship and thereby good society. And she gave examples from every sphere. She quoted and showed examples from healthcare to the armed forces, from central and local government. She talked about voluntary organisations, hospital staff, the caring of neighbours for neighbours, looking after those around us in our communities in need. And then she closed the address with these words. To all of us on this Christmas day, whatever your conditions of work and life, easy or difficult, whether you feel like you're achieving something or whether you feel frustrated, I want to say to you a word of thanks. And I include all of those who don't even realise they deserve thanks and are content that what they do is unseen and unrewarded. Their very act of living an upright life is a positive factor in maintaining civilised standards. You know, to me, it's as if the Queen had internalised and extrapolated out the truth that lies in the core of Colossians 3, verse 17. She confirmed by her words and actions that yes, we can do what we do, whatever we do, for God. There is certainly no doubt about the identity of the King of heaven that our Queen served. Nor is there any doubt that the prayer that we as a people often prayed. Well, we sang it, and most people sang it without realizing it was a prayer, that it was indeed answered, because we sang and we prayed, and God did indeed save our Queen. Our Queen was gracious. Our Queen was victorious in the things that really matter. Her hope and faith in Christ and her love of God and of the people, she had been empowered by God not to rule, not to reign, although that was part of us, but fundamentally to serve. Indeed, there can be few greater indications of God's mercy and grace upon our nation, because despite, as a nation, our turning away from God, he still allowed her, kept her in place, continued to give us her, and maintain her as our Queen for years and years beyond anything we might have hoped or expected, and allowed her to serve us faithfully and maintain pointing to him very clearly right up till the end. So praise be to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ for the gift of his service, of his servant Elizabeth. And I pray that God, our new King, in his reign, might initially, maybe at the point of his coronation also, gain a new insight, a new ability to grasp hold of this and apply the love of God in Christ that his mother had. And I ask that God would grant it to him in equal measure. And it is with that perspective I pray for that to be so.